Welcome back, guys. The FIDE Candidates Tournament 2026 is coming to an end. Today is round number 10, and at least in the men's section, it has become clear that Javokir Sundarov is the one to watch out for, and he has pretty good chances to win the tournament. In today's video, I wanted to focus on 3 games from the tournament so far, and there have been a couple of interesting Rook Endgames, which I want to show you here. After the tournament finishes, I'm of course planning to make a video about the most important theoretical developments in the openings, since everyone is so well prepared there and many cool ideas have been played, but I'm saving this for when the event has finished. Now, I want to focus on 3 games in this video. The first one was between Andrei Esipenko and Hikaru Nakamura in round number 2. As I was saying, there were quite a few interesting Rook Endgames, and the first one was already in round number 2 between those 2 players. The interesting thing is we're also going to see another game between the 2 of them when Hikaru was on the attacking side of a very similar Rook Endgame. Now, here Esipenko had the white pieces and they came into this Rook Endgame right here, and Hikaru defended this one pretty well. We have the typical 3 versus 3 plus an extra a-pawn. But black has weakened the king side already with f5, which was also in the second game, which we're about to see, where white actually was winning in Goryachkina against Deshmukh. So here, Esipenko started with rook a7 check, king f6, and a5. This endgame is a draw, just to have that said in the beginning. But black actually needs to be quite careful here, and Nakamura defended this pretty well. He started with a move rook c3, which is very powerful and very good. Black also still had some other ways of defending. He could also give a check on c1 here. But playing slowly with rook c2 is surprisingly not enough to save a draw, because white can now play rook b7 and try to get the rook to the side. Rook b6 check and now a6. And here white is winning because white can slowly try to bring the king to the queen side, and then the a-pawn is going to decide the game. Again, look at black's move f5, which here definitely does not help. I mean, the same position also with a pawn on f7 could also be quite a close call already. But the weakening of the 7th rank in this type of endgame usually is something which is not so great for black. Now Hikaru played rook c3, which was good, but only with the concrete point that black has to move rook c2 check. And in the game after king e3, another check with rook c3 check. Again, other moves are not enough to save the draw here. Like, for example, if you want to stay from behind with rook a3, now a6. And I've analyzed a few lines here. One would be rook a2 check, rook a3 check. Kind of similar idea like in the game to continue checking. But here, white can already play king c4. And after rook takes f3, white has a couple of different wins. But I wanted to show one which is quite instructive. We've seen the same winning idea with rook c7 in my theoretical Rook Endgame series, which you can check out on my channel. And the point of rook c7, we've also discovered it in the 3 versus 3 plus an extra a-pawn. It's the similar idea here, that this is even more precise than rook b7. In this specific case, rook b7 was also winning. But generally with this a-pawn, this rook c7 move can be quite smart, as we can see in a second. Now rook a3, a7. And after g5, now important king b5. And now we can see why this rook is good on the c file. Actually here, I mean, you could argue the same idea also exists with the rook being here, but specifically after the move king e5. Now, if the rook is on b7, it's not so clear how white could win. But here, not rook f7, but rook c5 check. This is the whole point. And if king e4 comes, then rook c4 check, and then rook a4 is coming on the next move. And yeah, black can just resign because white will make a new queen on the next move. It would be, by the way, a big mistake to automatically capture on g5, because black can take back with the king, and now black is in time to have counterplay on the king side, and there are no more checks from the sides with this rook a6 idea, which is an important winning idea. So this king b5 was nice, and now white is, I think, fairly easily winning. Like, these rook sacrifices, they just won't work here because the king is just still close enough to come back in time, and white is winning. Another line which I looked at was to go g5 here, take rook a8, and even here interesting was that you can just go for this position with a7, forcing king g7 because rook g8 is a winning threat, followed by queening. And now probably the easiest is just to go f4. I assume you can also immediately start running with the king, but just to understand that this endgame is winning for white, it's pretty important, theoretical knowledge. Because black cannot do anything, the king can never move. It has to stay on either h7 or g7, because if you try to run over, there's always this trick with rook h8. Rook takes a7 and rook f7, winning the rook. Typical idea in this type of endgame. And if black continues waiting, just to see how white is winning, you're going to bring the king. And it's important that white has the f-pawn, because in this endgame, in the end, you're going to win the f5 pawn because of Zugzwang. Here, important king e5, forcing black to check, and now king e6. And now black is in Zugzwang. If the rook moves here, then we can just take the pawn. And if king h7, then white can play king f6. Rook has to move. And also in this endgame, it's important that it's an f-pawn. If it would be a g-pawn, it's a draw. But here the thing is, since the king has to stay on either h7 or g7, white can just push the f-pawn. Like, for example, if black waits, just f5, and king g7 doesn't do anything because we can go f6 check. And if the king takes again, this is winning because white is queening on the next move. And again, if the king goes here, now f7 is just winning. And if king f7, then again, rook h8 is winning with the same idea which we've seen earlier, picking up the rook on a7. So I thought this was quite instructive here. I mean, as I said, I think you don't necessarily need to play f4 here, but it's probably just the simplest to remember that this one is winning, because, like, for example, if black plays, if you start running over, I'm just thinking now, if you go f4 here, I'm not so sure that this is winning. I think this is probably a draw, because even if you get, I mean, you will get the king to the 4th rank at some point, but even if you are going to manage that, then black still has the tempo with the king. King h7, king g7. And here it looks like a draw to me, if I'm not wrong. So it's important to have to fix the pawn on the f5 square. I guess that this is still winning now with the important move g4, because again you can bring the king and then you will probably win the g5 pawn with the Zugzwang. Let's just put this on the board. Actually, I'm not so sure here how you would get it, because if king f5, there's still a check and you don't have king f6 here, and you need to go king e6, and now there is no way to get over there. Still, there could be some possibilities to go to some pawn endgames, perhaps. Like, I don't know, this could be one winning idea maybe, and then rook d7 check. And I guess that this pawn endgame is winning, because we are going to win the g5 pawn in the end. But you get my point. It's probably the easiest if you start with f4, and then white is going to win the f5 pawn. So this was a nice way to show how to win here. In the game, Hikaru played rook c2 check, king e3, rook c3 check, and this is the best way to draw the game. If king d4 here, black is just way too fast, and rook takes g3. And in a position like this, I mean, white already has to be a bit careful not to over push, because black does have quite a lot of counterplay. Esipenko tried king e2, now rook c2 check, another important move. King d3, and now rook g2. This was the whole drawing idea, and black is just in time to start counterplay. Let's see how the game concluded. Hikaru tried king d4 here, rook takes g3, king e5, but too many pawns come off the board. Rook a7 check, king e8. And after a6, rook a3, king e6, king d8, king f6, the players agreed to a draw. I think that black has quite a few different ways of drawing here. g5 is probably the cleanest. And yeah, if white takes, king can just run over, and white only has one pawn left, so it's an easy draw. I was thinking if white could try something else, maybe rook h7 could be a better try here. It's still a draw by many different ways, but at least here it felt like black had to be maybe a little bit more careful. If king d8 now, rook h6. And this position, black still needs to defend at least. I mean, there are many different ways to do so. For example, rook a4 and rook h4. But here at least black had to, make some decisions, I thought, at the very least. Like, this was drawing in the end, because there's always a check, rook g2 check. And the rook can never block, because then black can make another queen. Black can make a queen by himself. And otherwise, if king f7, you can just go back and forth. Yeah, so this was the first game I wanted to show you. I thought that was fairly instructive. Now let's go to the next one, which was Goryachkina against Deshmukh of the women's candidates of round number 3. And this was a much better version for white, because there is still one more pair of pawns on the queen side. I've had also similar endgames like this in the past, and usually, especially if white's rook is so active, they should be winning. I had a similar endgame also. I mean, not so similar, but a little bit similar in the World Cup in game number 1 against Lupulescu. And the thing here is, also here, the pawn being on f6 definitely doesn't help black, because it's weakening the 7th rank. This was the position on the board with black to move. But the thing is generally that now white is the one who can choose when to exchange those 2 pawns and when to go into this 3 against 3. Usually it's going to end up with an a pawn in the very end. Now here, black's problem is that simplifying with rook takes b3 does not really help, because here black will also be very passive. White will get rook a6, and the black rook needs to be very passive on the 7th rank. And I've clicked around here a bit. White can even win with f3 and g4, which, yeah, I mean, it's kind of logical that you have to advance like this, because you cannot really bring over the king. Black can always cut us off with rook e7. At first, when I was looking at this, I thought it was a bit surprising that the computer is winning by exchanging one more pair of pawns, which usually favors the defender. But it appears that even this endgame is fairly easily winning, I guess, because now also the pawn on g6 is always attacked, and the rook always needs to stay on the 7th rank. King h6 never works because of h5. And if black continues waiting, then no. If the rook moves, then king e5 comes. And the king also doesn't have many great squares to go to, because if this, then king g5 comes and king f6. And if king f7, then I can go king g5, and the g6 pawn is hanging. And if check, then king h6 is winning. So I looked at rook c7, but now king e5, the king is entering. And at some point, I guess you can also try to run over to the a pawn, and it should be winning. So Divya tried f5 to keep the pawn, rook c7 check, king h6, rook b7, and this was nice, yeah, to keep the pawn, because if you take immediately, maybe this is also winning, but there's no point to do that immediately if you can still keep the tension and now just improve your position first. So this is what Goryachkina did. a5, king g2, rook c3, and she brought the king. That was very good. King f1, rook c1 check, king e2, and now rook c3. Divi defended pretty well here, because if you give a check first, now this will only help white, because they can just bring the king. And I assume that this should be... Actually, I'm not so sure here, because if rook b5, I mean, black does get some counterplay herself here. This would be quite complicated. I guess this could be still good for white, but... well, at the very least, white can go for this, which should transpose back to the game. Yeah, this was the position in the game. And here Goryachkina played the move f3, which I'm not sure that I love so much, out of the easy explanation that whenever you run over with the king, then black can sometimes at least capture an f3, and then immediately the pawn on g3 is hanging as well. I understand that she wanted to put up kind of a zugzwang, because now black does not have any moves with the king, and black needs to move the rook, after which the king can become active. So this is a reasonable explanation, and f3 is still winning. But I was thinking if it's now maybe time to go rook b5 just, and let the king escape from h6, and now take on a5. And now to play rook b5, important to try to get the rook beside the pawn. And after rook a3, a5. And now white is ready to run over with the king, like king f7, king d2. And this is what I meant. Now black can take on f2, but now at least black is not threatening to take the next pawn on the next move, which is the case if black captures the pawn on f3. So now a6, rook a2, and rook b6. And another important factor here is that black's pawns are fixed on the king side, so black does not really have any hopes of getting any counterplay, and white will just march over with the king, and this should be more or less an easy win. How Goryachkina played, it is still winning with f3, rook c2 check, king e3, rook c3 check, king f4. This was her idea, but it was not so simple now. Rook d3, rook b5, black continued waiting, and now Goryachkina took on a5. You cannot really improve the king now, because then black can just capture the pawn on f3. So this was what happened in the game. And also here, she played rook a8. I think it was easier to play rook b5 now. Again, trying to get the rook beside the pawn. And after rook a3, now a5. And if king g7, I think king g5 is fairly easily winning, I guess, because if rook takes f3, I can give a check. And the king even needs to go to the last rank. And now I can even play a6. I'm not even really interested to take this pawn. I will just get the pawn to a7. And I don't know, king f6 or king h6, I don't think it really matters, because I will get a7 and then rook b8 check, followed by queening is coming on the next move. So after rook b5, rook a3, a5. If rook a4 check, then king e5 is, yeah, I think quite easily winning now, because you're again ready to run over the king, and black's counterplay is basically non-existent. So I think this was by far the easier win here. She played rook a8. Rook b4 check, king e5, rook b3, and now king f6. Divya played king h7 now. Rook b6 check does not really change much. White will get with the king to f8 and then start to run with the a pawn. So I think king h7 was a good defensive try. And here it was already quite difficult, I think, for Goryachkina to spot the right winning plan. She played rook a7 check, king f7, and now king f8, which she still had a chance now to win if she goes back with king f7. But the way she played with rook a6, king h7, king f7, it was already a draw here. I will go back to the winning moment in a second, just to show how the game was drawn. Here, after rook takes g6, f4 was the key move. And after rook f6, if white takes, then just rook takes f4 with a double attack is quite a simple draw. So rook f6 was played, rook takes g3, and after rook takes f4, now the key move, rook g4, because white cannot take, because the g-pawn will be running towards a queen. And after rook f5, which was played in the game, just rook takes h4, a5, king h6, and it was a fairly simple draw from here on. So how could Goryachkina have won here? It was still okay to start with rook a7, but you need to transpose back to this position anyway, and the only winning idea is to play king g5 now. To give the pawn here, but now to have rook a7 check, not allowing this king to go to h6. And I thought it was quite difficult to evaluate that this endgame is winning here, because this is really move by move. If black is maybe one tempo faster, then it could already be a draw, because I mean you only have two. You have an a pawn and an h pawn, which is generally not the perfect pawn in in Rook Endgames, because the drawing margins increase by quite a bit. But white still appears to be winning after rook g4, a5, only winning move, rook h4, rook takes h4, and now a6, only winning move. And now again, white is threatening just to move the rook, and then a7, which would be winning, so black needs to try rook a4. And now again, the only winning move here is king g6, setting up a checkmate idea with rook to a8. So black can try either rook g4 check or king f8. If king f8, then I have a check and a7. And again, we reach this type of setup where white is threatening rook h8 on the next move, and there's nothing black can do about it. I mean, you can give a couple of checks, but the king is just going to run over. And since the king is on e7 and not on f7, this is just barely winning for white. Like, for example, like this. And in the end, there is this idea with rook h8, and I'm winning the rook. And king e7 also does not, king f7 also does not save black, because white is just in time to get rook h8. If we have this position with black to move, it's obviously a draw, because black is in time to play king g7. Another option also for black is to go rook g4 check here, king takes h5, and then rook a4 back, king g6, rook g4 check, and try to give checks like this. But now the king is running over to the queen side, for example, like this, and king d5. Still, I mean, to see all of this, it's not so easy, I believe. Even to enter this endgame, I mean, I think that many players here would not be certain at all that this would be winning, and it's just really move by move to figure out that this is a win in the end. So again, I think the key lessons are, I mean, as I said, f3, there could be improved upon maybe with rook b5, but this is a critique on a very high level because f3 is still winning by quite a few different ideas. I think the bigger thing is here not to play rook a8, but instead to play rook b5, which really seems like the simpler win, just to get the rook beside the pawn and then getting ready to run over with the king. I assume that she must have missed something in her calculation with rook a8. Maybe she thought that this was quite a straightforward win, but the way Divi defended it was not so easy then to find the right winning idea. I think this was the most complex rook endgame of all of them, but there was one other one which was actually played yesterday between, again, Nakamura and Esipenko, this time Nakamura with the white pieces. Maybe some of you have also seen the middle game. It was also quite interesting how the rook endgame entered. Esipenko showed some interesting preparation in the opening. I think quite a new idea, which looked quite passive, and white did have kind of a nice small advantage here, but he analyzed it pretty well and decided that in the end it was definitely playable and solid enough for black, which is definitely the case. And they got some heavy piece endgame like this, which white is trying something here because black has the worst pawn structure. Specifically, the pawn on c6 is a weakness, but with good play, black should be able to hold a draw here. And after a bit of maneuvering, Hikaru was able to get an endgame with an extra pawn up here, take, and 8 takes b3, and this is the position where we're going to start at, rook b6, rook e3. And with the rook on the side here, it's actually not so... I mean, it's quite close for black here, and it comes down to one tempo. This position is a draw here, but if it would be white to move, I checked it, if it would be white to move and king f1 is already on the board here, then it's already winning. And I thought that was quite interesting to show. Let's firstly see how the game went to understand what is black's best drawing defense here. Esipenko went for f6, which I also believe to be the most straightforward and best way to draw the game. Now Hikaru played f4, which also seems logical because you try to stop g5. If you play king f1 instead, black can play king f7 first. Maybe g5 also works, but it can only allow rook e5 now, which I'm not so sure if it's... Maybe there are still some resources here, but I would definitely not allow that with black. So king f7 starting like that is definitely way more precise, and after king e2 now important to go g5. And well, if white takes, then black will always have some counter chances with the h-pawn. And if king d2, black can take and go rook b4, which is a draw because black can take the pawn on h4 in the next move. If rook h3 just looks too passive. I mean, now I'm not even sure if white is threatening something, because if king c3 comes, then black can just go rook f4, or rook f4 immediately probably also does the job. So Hikaru tried f4, king f7, king f2, but now Esipenko anyway went for g5, which is an important move. Otherwise, white has the simple plan to just bring over the king and support the b-pawn. And with g5, black is just in time to save the draw. Because if you don't take now, then black will always have this target on f4 to go after, like now rook b4, for example. So Hikaru took twice, king g6, king e2, the best plan, trying to support the b-pawn, king takes g5, and now king d2. And here there was one final important moment for this endgame. And actually black only has one move to save the game here. So if you want to use this as an exercise, then make sure to stop the video and try to understand what is white threatening and what can black do against it. The only drawing move was found, of course, by Esipenko, which is the move rook to b8. And the whole point is that white in this position is threatening king c3 and then to push b4. So if black would make another logical move like king g4 here, then white is winning after king c3. Because now if black wants to give checks here, the rook is not doesn't have the distance which it wants to have, and now king c5 comes. That's why rook b8 before was important, because now you still have some checks with the rook, and here you don't, because the rook is under attack and white is able to play b4, after which it's winning, because now the checks won't do anything. I mean, you can give a check, but now I can play king d6 and now rook b3, supporting the pawn, and king c6, b5 is coming next, and white is winning. And I guess that this here should not be working out in time. Maybe check here, king g2, king f4, h3, check here, and yeah, white is in time to win the game. So that's why it's important for black to start with rook b8, and after king c3, now there is a check. And now whenever you try to run with the king, even, well, you can continue giving a check, but also rook b8 is a draw because there's no b4. And after king c5, again threatening b4, rook c8 check important. And if king here, then rook b8, again, an important move. And after king c7, then black can just go to b4, and there's no way to make progress for white. Just important after king c6 to go back to b8, because again, now king c5 would be a threat, and after the rook moves, there would be b4. But again, like this, and now you can give checks again, and black can make a draw. So Hikaru still tried something here, but the result of the game was never really in doubt, unless black would move the rook from the 8th rank, then it could be a bit risky, but Esipenko of course understood that he wants to keep the rook here, and also keep these h-pawns as a counterplay. Like if you take here, it could be quite risky, because now white might be able to use the rook to advance the pawn. Also not so sure how exactly this would now be winning. Maybe like this. This could be one idea. And king d4, and then something like rook d5. And if we imagine still the g and h pawn being on the board, then black could go to the pawn endgame and use his extra h pawn. So that's why you don't really want to exchange those two pawns in this specific position, but just to wait around and always have those checks from behind. Now, what I said in the beginning, if we have the same endgame with white to move, it is winning, because black is just not in time to get this setup. So if black wants to do the same with g5, take, and now king g6, now white is in time for king d2, and after king takes g5, now king c3. And now again, we have this winning setup, and white is winning with rook b3. One other interesting question would be how white would win after rook b8 now. I did not analyze that, but I guess king c3, rook c8 check, king d4, again threatening b4 here, and maybe there is some idea to give rook e6 check. I'm thinking right now, like this would be one. The pawn is also hanging. Let me quickly check this, because I did not analyze what happens if black waits to take the pawn. King c3 is still correct, king d4, rook b8. That's actually quite interesting. King c5, rook c8 check, king d6, rook b8. How is he making progress here? King c7, rook b4, let's say. King c6 here. It's not so easy to understand the winning idea. I guess at some point it should be rook e5 to keep the pawn protected. Maybe I can get that actually, like this. And now king c3. Yeah, this should be the winning idea. Now king b2. Now again, I'm threatening b4, so black needs to play rook b8, and then I can play rook e5, protecting the pawn. And now I should be able to, like if black makes some type of waiting move, to play king c3. And now I should be able to block the check at some point, like for example here. And now since black's king is not on g4, he cannot go to the pawn endgame, because he's just going to be way too slow to hold the game here. Yeah, so I think those endgames were quite interesting. One final thing which I wanted to say here, black can also start with king g7 and king f6. This is also possible. But again, now it would be very important to play f6 at the right time. Otherwise, black would be losing here. Apparently, it's still saving a draw just with g5 in time. But I think the way Esipenko played was by far the most accurate one. And I'm sure he really did his homework here, because he played the rest of the game very quickly, and also quite, it seemed like he was very confident in defending this endgame, and it seemed like his knowledge was really on a good level in this endgame. Anyway, that was it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this small video on Rook Endgames. Hopefully that was something more interesting, because there's a lot of content on the candidates out there, and I wanted to talk about something which maybe was not talked about on some other channels. Let me know what you think about the last few remaining rounds. Who are you rooting for? Who do you think is going to win? In the men's section, as I said, I think Sindarov is by far the most likely to win, but in the women's section, it is by far from clear. All of the players are very compact there. There is no clear leader in the women's section. But still, really excited for the remaining games. And yeah, that was it for today, guys. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also find more of my stuff in the video description down below. Check out my website, felixbroberger.com, for more information as well. And I will see you guys soon. Take care.